Before I share my thoughts for today, and you'll see why using that word or phrase, I'd like to thank you for becoming part of Peace is the Way and taking certification in it, and also becoming a soul of leadership leader. And for those of you who are still in in a pause moment before you join, please consider becoming the peace that you want to see in the world. Only your peace can create world peace. And so check out the URL, cfi.choprafoundation.org, and join us. Let's create that critical mass. So today's ideas I want to share begin with the question, how are thoughts generated? How is our thinking generated? And I think it's important to know that, because everything that happens in our mind, in our body, and in the world collectively is the consequence of the generation of thought. So if you ask a neuroscientist how thoughts are generated, the first answer is that it is a mystery, and that they arise from complex interactions of billions of neurons in the brain. Neurons communicate with each other through electrical and chemical signals. Chemicals also at the most fundamental level, at the level of ions, is in electrical activity. That's why we say electrochemicals. And these signals can form intricate patterns that represent thoughts, memories, and ideas. So one theory of how thoughts are generated is that they arise from the activation of specific neural circuits. When a particular neural circuit is activated, it produces a pattern of electrical activity that is associated with a particular thought. For example, the thought of a red apple may be associated with the activation of a circuit in the visual cortex, right, the back of your brain. Another theory is that thoughts are generated by the synchronized activity of neural circuits across different brain regions. When neurons in different regions fire in a coordinated manner, they can create a larger and more complex pattern of activity that is associated with thought. In addition, of course, thoughts generate neurotransmitters, which are chemicals that bind to receptors everywhere in the body, which also happen to be immunomodulators. Also, the hormones are chemicals that are released by glands into the bloodstream, and these can affect brain activity and can influence the way that thoughts are generated. And then, of course, scientists will point out that sensory input from the environment can also influence the way that thoughts are generated. For example, the sight of a red apple may trigger the thought of eating an apple. Okay, so all that's very good, but then you go a little further, and if you ask scientists, what is the source of thought? So what is the source of these thoughts that I'm communicating to you? And again, if you ask mainstream neuroscientists, they'll say from a biological perspective, thoughts are seen as the product of neural activity in the brain. When we think, neurons in different parts of the brain get activated. But from a psychological perspective, thoughts are seen as the product of mental processes such as memory, attention, and language. So when we think, we draw on our memories, we focus our attention, and we use language to represent thought. Then, of course, there's a philosophical question, and that is, what is really the ultimate source of thought? And this is a question that has been asked forever. And this question is seen as much more fundamental, and it is about the nature of consciousness. Some philosophers believe that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, while others believe it is an emergent property of complex systems such as the brain. And of course, there are many other perspectives, the role of environment, etc., relationships, and much more. Is thought a result of quantum entanglement in the brain? Okay, that's a very important question. And actually, a lot of scientists do believe that quantum entanglement could play a role in the generation and the processing of thought. It has been suggested that entangled particles could be used to represent the different states of a neuron. And if two neurons are entangled, then a change in the state of one neuron could instantly cause a change in the other neuron. This could allow for rapid and efficient transformation of information between neurons. And some scientists have also suggested that this is a phenomenon that occurs in consciousness alone, that consciousness is the ultimate ground of all experience, and consciousness functions similarly to a quantum field, or the quantum field, with particles appearing as determined by the uncertainty principle, and they appear and disappear very rapidly. And I'm sure that's the experience of your thoughts, but sometimes thoughts get repetitious because of habits of the conditioned mind. So, is there a solution to this conundrum? And I think there is. So, first of all, ask yourself, what generates the thought which asks, what is the origin of thought? What is it that asks how thought is produced? What is it that asks how thought is produced? Does the brain ask itself how thought is produced? And if so, how does a material object composed of matter with carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and a few other chemicals, and mostly water and fat, how does a physical object ask a question about itself? That's the most important thing to ask right now. So I think if we go a little deeper, I think we can make a case that the brain is a human construct for the mind. Okay, the brain is what the mind looks like as a perceptual object, or even better, the brain is what the mind looks like as a perceptual activity. And what is the mind? The mind is a modified conditioning of pure consciousness, which is infinite possibilities, self-regulation, non-local correlation or entanglement. It embodies the uncertainty principle, and it requires attention and intention. So some of these points I've already made in my statements a little while ago. The mind looks very much then the conditioning of pure consciousness as even a quantum mechanical expression of the conditioned mind. The conditioned mind is the result of karma. Karma means past experience and the interpretation of past experience. And karma, of course, projects into future as desire. So birth, karma, memory, and desire are entangled as one process. And karma is all the experiences we've had in the past. And unfortunately, right now, when we see the conflict in the world, then we can see that the conflict is the traumatic experiences of different people going back to hunter-gatherer times and the beginning of culture, identity, religion, politics, kingdoms, and especially the conditioned religious mind that is tied to its dogma, ideology, story as a result of past trauma. And as I mentioned before, nobody has not experienced trauma. So we are all kind of conditioned minds, and our trauma recycles as anger, hostility, guilt, shame, mistrust, and then recycles as inflammation, chronic disease, mental illnesses which are proposed in the past. In other words, thought, karma, memory, desire, imagination are ultimately the result of all conflict in the world. And it is thought that ultimately creates our patterns of speech and action and behavior. Is there a solution to this? And I think there is. First of all, understand that your mind is entangled with all other minds, but your mind only agrees with minds that agree with you, who have the same conditioning or karma or memories, or how those memories project into future patterns of thinking and behavior. In other words, the conflict in the world is a karmic conflict. And the only way to find a solution is to transcend the whole karmic process by going to the source of thought. The source of thought, before it's conditioned, is actually infinite possibilities. And I mentioned in a previous post that thought emerges from infinite possibilities into clouds of probability, then the internal dialogue, and finally speech. When speech occurs, that's the collapse of the wave function. As infinite possibilities, thought is just potential for thought. At clouds of probability, it is coalescing into a particular pattern of thought. As the internal dialogue, you hear these patterns in your consciousness. You have the ability to choose, but once you speak and act, then it's solidified into the ecosystem of conflict. On a practical level, then, meditation and the transcendence of thought allows us to experience our universal nature, where there is only empathy and compassion and love and joy and equanimity, and ultimately the resolution of all conflict. Think about this, and reflect on it. And of course, you'll immediately realize that your thought patterns are a result of past conditioning. Then ask yourself, is what I'm thinking fundamentally true? How do I know it's fundamentally true? What if what I'm thinking is not fundamentally true? And what would my true self do in this situation? And then what is the opposite of this conflicting thought that I'm having? Okay. If you go through this process, you can become a peacemaker, and you can bring peace to yourself. You can bring peace to your family. You can bring peace to your community. You can bring peace to your nation, and you can bring peace to the world, because all these things that we call me, mine, my family, my community, my country, my nation, my world, my universe, all these begin with a thought. If we unravel the mystery of thought, we can collectively create a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier, and a joyful world. Let me know your thoughts